All right. Last week we talked about how the Jews of the first century were actively looking for the Messiah that was promised in the Old Testament to come at that time in the first century, the time of the first century AD. Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks, and we had mentioned that, Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks, and I said that a more appropriate translation might be 70 sets of 7 rather than 70 literal weeks. Because when we talk about 70 weeks, we think about we think about 70 sets of 7-day periods. And that's not what they're talking about in Daniel. That's not how that's really translated. It's 70 sets of 7. And that prophecy everybody thought that prophecy pointed to the first century Israel as the time and place where the Messiah, who had been prophesied to free the Jews from captivity to the Romans, would come and would announce himself. That 70 sets of 7 would be 490 altogether. And everybody back then, all of the learned people and scribes and whoever back then, interpreted that as 490 years. And if you know Jewish history, Daniel was written about 490 years before the first century AD, somewhere in that area. And so they were looking for the Messiah to come. We also talked briefly about how Jesus was treated by the Roman soldiers and how in many ways we're not that much different today. We've always treated other people wrongly, and we're going to continue to do so. If you remember, I read that account of that letter that my uncle had written to a newspaper where he was in Fort Riley during World War I, and he was in the medical part of that. And when they operated on black men, they did not use any anesthetic. When they operated on white people, they did. Why, I don't know, but that's just the way it was. And he said they really screamed and hollered, and I suppose they would, And he said he couldn't stand it and he had to leave. He couldn't be in the same room when they were doing that kind of thing. And that was just during World War I. And to say nothing of the Second World War and a bunch of stuff that's happened in between then and now. We talked about how we might have reacted had we been part of that crowd that was gathered at Jesus' trial with Pilate, or if we would have been maybe one of the Roman soldiers, how we might have had been thinking differently, and we might have treated Jesus the same way that they did. We have to conclude, I think, that we probably would have behaved in much the same way as the crowd, much the same way as the Roman soldiers. And then we concluded the lesson with a kind of a sidebar of Jesus talking with some women, if you remember that, on his way to being crucified. And what was recorded for us, Jesus is talking with them about not what was happening at the moment, not about the crucifixion itself, but rather what he foresaw as happening at some time in the future regarding Jerusalem. He had on his mind that at that particular time, rather than what all of us would have had on our minds, we're walking toward our deaths, we're walking toward our crucifixions. But he talked to these women about something differently. And he foretells these women about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And in part of this conversation, Jesus says, look, the days are coming when people will say, blessed are the barren women, the wombs that never bore and breasts that have never nursed. At that time they'll say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. I've really found it really remarkable that Jesus is thinking about that kind of thing rather than what's happening going to the way of his crucifixion and his death. Destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD evidently was a much more important event than we give credit for. I mean, it was just to say it was a watershed event in the lives of Jewish life is probably an understatement. as and as we so often do when we look at something biblical or we read a biblical passage, what we find in the Bible and what we find in secular history of the Jewish nation, we kind of gloss over the destruction of Jerusalem. We kind of, well, yeah, we had that in AD 70, around AD 70, the Romans did that. They ransacked Jerusalem, they killed a bunch of people, and so what? You know, we kind of do that. Nothing would ever be the same again, though, for the Jewish nation. I mean, stop and think about it. The temple, the seat of Jewish worship. I mean, we have a nice building here, but it's this building, we don't think of this building anything like they thought of their temple. I mean, their temple was, it was the, how would I say it? It was the pinnacle of their worship. I mean, it was something that made them the nation that they were, I guess. And I mean, the temple was that symbol. It was destroyed. The Jewish leadership, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, those groups of people, they were decimated. The records of ancestors and Jewish history were destroyed along with the temple. Other records Jews kept and believed necessary for society, those were destroyed as well. Jewish people no longer could say with certainty that they were of the tribe of Levi, or that they were of the tribe of Judah, or that they were of the tribe of Simeon, because they didn't have the records anymore. Those records were destroyed. And even to this day, Jewish people cannot say which of the 12 tribes they were a part of or where they came from. That was just awfully, awfully important to them. You know, we a lot of times like to talk about our ancestry, and maybe, you know, we originally came from Germany, or we came from Ireland, or we came from wherever. But for the Jewish people, this was so much more important than just saying, well, I have some Irish in me, or I have some French blood in me, or I have whatever. For them, it was a part of their identity. That was all destroyed. The city itself, Jerusalem, was virtually destroyed. Multiple tens of thousands of people were killed. Multiple tens of thousands of people were killed. The scene was much as Jesus had described to those women. The Roman attack began 3 days before a Passover, when there were a lot of Jews either already in Jerusalem or they were coming to Jerusalem for the feast. The takeover of the city, and in essence the takeover of the Jewish nation. If they took over the city and the temple, they in essence had taken over the Jewish nation. And that was completed by about August of that year, about 5 months after it began. This siege, this war of attrition lasted for 5 months or more. And it was 5 months of constant presence of Romans just wearing down Jerusalem and wearing down the Jewish nation. There were several Jewish zealots and their followers who either participated in or encouraged the uprising of the Jews against the Romans throughout Israel, not just in Jerusalem. Those people and those things were crushed by the Romans, not only in Jerusalem, but throughout the nation. Never again in the Jewish nation would there be this kind of an uprising against the authority that would take place. And because of the attack on Jerusalem by the Romans, Christianity began to be more fervently separated from Judaism. That was a process that evolved over time, well into the 4th and 5th centuries. Up until that time, Judaism and Christianity were kind of hand in hand in many ways. But at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and the time of the destruction of, I'll just say the destruction of Jewish society in that day, Christianity separated itself more from the Jewish religion. Any questions, comments on the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple? Okay, Jesus then is crucified. That's where we're at. Jesus then is crucified. I want you to consider some points from the crucifixion account These points I've taken from Mark. Their other Gospels have some points, I'm sure, that are not found in Mark, but I'm just going through the points that are in Mark because that's the book that I said we'd be mainly going through. For example, Mark doesn't describe the piercing with the sword. Mark doesn't describe the not breaking of the bones. That's found in other Gospels. These are the things that are found in Mark. Jesus refused the wine and myrrh mixture, which was thought to be a kind of a pain-deadening concoction. He refused that. Mark also says that the soldiers gambled for his clothing. Fulfillment of prophecy. Mark says that Jesus was crucified beginning the 3rd hour of the day, about 9 o'clock in the morning. Mark talks about an inscription that was hung over the cross, which read something like, "This is the King of the Jews," or "the King of the Jews," that Pilate had ordered put up. Mark talks about the 2 robbers that were crucified along with Jesus, one on the left and one on the right. Mark talks about passers-by who were insulting and further abusing Jesus, and I'm sure the robbers too. And those people passing by included Jewish leaders, scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, those kinds of people. Mark talks about darkness that came on the land from the 6th hour, about noon, till the 9th hour, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I don't know if you know of anything. I don't really know. I did some research on it. I couldn't find anything in secular history about a 3-hour or so period of darkness about that time. I don't know if any of you know anything about any of that or not, but I couldn't find anything. To my knowledge, Josephus doesn't mention it, and other historians and other secular accounts don't really mention that kind of thing. Mark talks about the veil of the temple torn in two from top to bottom. What's important about that?
Separated where the priests could be and where the regular people could be.
Yeah, this veil in the temple was something that separated the holy place from the most holy place. And it was a place where only the priests were supposed to go. And the most holy place was a place where only one priest, I think, was supposed to go only once a year. It was really the center or the seat of Jewish worship. And in the old days, the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, was the place where the Ark of the Covenant had been. Of course, there was no Ark of the Covenant in the time of Christ, but that's where the Ark of the Covenant had been. And that's where the offering was made once a year for the sins of the people.
Physically, I think maybe read this twice, and I never really hear about it, but that wasn't, you think of a little old curtain, or maybe something like curtain draperies. But I've read that the weaving on that was an inch thick. It was a massive, heavy curtain veil. And then, of course, the fact that it was ripped from top to bottom, and it was relatively tall. But I imagine the weight of that thing.
Yeah, I think it's something like 15 feet high, something like that. It's a little tough to translate their height and numbers into modern day, but something like that. And yes, it was thick. And one reason why it was thick was to make sure that nobody went into the most holy place by accident, and to make sure nobody could see into it, and to make sure that it was kept totally separate from the rest of the temple. And it was torn in two, Mark says, and others do, from top to bottom. Now, what significance that is, some people make significance to that. I don't know what the significance of that really is, except to say that if human beings would have torn it in two or managed to have done so, it would have been from bottom to top. They wouldn't have climbed on some ladder and ripped it up from the top to the bottom. What is the the symbolizing, Jim, you had said something about the holy place and the most holy place, the symbol of the separating of the curtain.
It meant that the people didn't have direct access to God or
Right.
Christ.
Right, and now,
You had to go through somebody between you.
now that's been torn open, that's been opened up, and now people would have direct access to God through Jesus, the mediator. Yeah. Matthew records an earthquake upon the death of Jesus with tombs and grave opening and some who were dead coming to life. Matthew's the only one who does that. I did decide to put that in there.
Was there ever any record of how long those people in Lazarus lived after they were raised from the dead?
Not to my knowledge, Norma. I don't know that anyone, again, this is something that I don't know that in secular history that is recorded as something that has happened. And I have no information on how much longer Lazarus, for example, might have lived. I don't know how old he was. I don't know how young he was. He might have been a young man that succumbed at an age that was maybe a little bit early, and he may have lived 20, 30 years afterwards. I don't know. If he's an older man, he probably wouldn't have lived very much longer. Yeah, I don't know.
Jay, there was just a little blurb, there's that one little liner in there about the graves, don't know how many, well, maybe it did say something like a couple hundred perhaps.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember.
I find that that didn't even have to be put in there, but I think that is a fascinating and intriguing little bit of information. These men or women were dead, they're gone, rotted, maybe not even, and yet, and their spirit and their soul, two different things, but combined together because these were good folks, suddenly impacted back into they had resurrected bodies of some nature, and can you imagine that? Say, well, that person died 82 years ago, my goodness, something's weird going on here. But beyond that, you don't know what these people did and how long, but they died again, I guess. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
a weird little,
I'm assuming they died again.
that's just full of weirdness.
Yeah.
But it does say that they went into the holy city and appeared to many people.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, that would have been a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
You talk about The Walking Dead, those shows, they look better than that probably, but you think, oh my goodness, what's happening?
Sometimes I feel like I'm a Walking Dead person. I don't know, but yes, and again, Matthew's the only one that records that. There are a lot of critics that say that didn't happen. That kind of thing. Because only Matthew recorded it, and there's nothing in history about it. Well, you just take that.
Discount everything else he said.
Take
too,
that.
yeah,
Take
yeah.
that for what it's worth. Also, the centurion is recorded as confessing Jesus as the Son of God, or as the original text says, and probably was, the Son of a God. The centurion was a multiple God worshiper. He didn't know what monotheism was. And I'm guessing that he probably said, surely this man is the Son of a God. How he knew that, what Jesus' demeanor was, what happened. Maybe he saw the darkness. Maybe he saw the tombs open. Maybe he saw this kind of thing. He felt the earthquake and so on. And maybe that's one thing that prompted him to say what he said. He placed Jesus in among other gods that he knew or knew of. But there must have been something unique. There must have been something special. There must have been something different about what the centurion soldier saw and heard on that day for him to say that about Jesus. And again, we're not sure what it was that prompted him to say that. Maybe it was the way that Jesus accepted his crucifixion. Maybe it was some of the things that Jesus was saying from the cross. I don't know. The account doesn't say. But that was an important thing that was recorded as a centurion saying that kind of thing. And I have to wonder then if the centurion felt any guilt for what happened, for what he did, or what he ordered his soldiers to do. I don't know. All right, briefly, let's look at the 7 sayings of Jesus. Let's look at each one of these for just a minute. Jesus, I think these are in order from the different Gospels. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That might have been something that the centurion heard that might have prompted him to be thinking, okay, this is somebody a little bit different here. This is somebody that's not the normal guy that I hang up on a cross. But to ask forgiveness for the people who are killing him and mocking him and whatever, there's something totally unusual. And that's to say lightly about that. Did you have something? You act like you want to say something again, Terry.
I've thought about that passage, and I thought, what does that really mean? Forgiveness, but what does that, were they forgiven just of that act? Were they forgiven completely? And how many? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know.
What did that cover? Is that like a grace? When Jesus himself, God, but he asked his Father, forgive these people, Lord. So, I mean, in the hereafter, at the great judgment, they're going to say, God's going to say, well, look, that's clear, because the Son said to ask for that to be forgiven. I mean, it's just, who knows what that covers? I just think it's an interesting statement.
You'll find out sometime.
No, there's no answer yet.
There is.
I think it was a message to us too, that no matter what's done to us, we're to forgive. And
Norma, I think that's really important. And it's awfully hard to do. It's awfully tough to do. A lot of times it's a process. It's a process. Second saying, today you will be with me in paradise. He said that to the thief that was on whichever side it was, who said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The thief evidently had heard him speak, or had heard his disciples or something. The thief, I think, knew something about Jesus before he was put up there on the cross, I think. And again, nobody can tell for sure, but I think that's probably the case. And the thief saw something unusual and heard something unusual, just like the centurion did. Woman, behold your son, saying that to Mary. And your son would have been John. My God, why have you forsaken me? A lot has been preached and taught about this particular passage. Did God actually forsake Jesus? Did God actually turn his back on Jesus? Scripture doesn't say. But Jesus here is pulling something out of the Old Testament, out of the Psalms, and he's saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? I thirst. It is finished. And then one more. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And they tell me that word for it is finished means paid in full. That it was a word that was often put on bills of sale and invoices and that kind of thing when the bill had been paid. And into your hands I commit my spirit. Jesus gave up his spirit. I really believe that it was not taken from him, that he gave it at that time. Much of what happened during the crucifixion, including some of what Jesus said while hanging on the cross, had been prophesied centuries before. In fact, a lot of the last 24 hours was, and I don't mean to make light of this, a lot of the last 24 hours of the life of Jesus before his crucifixion was kind of scripted in a way. There's so much prophecy having to do with it. and the fulfillment was complete. It was really kind of like going through a script a little bit. And again, I don't mean to belittle that or make light of that in any way at all. But it just demonstrates to me anyway, this is the way it was supposed to be. This was how this was supposed to go. This had been in the plan all along. Questions, comments, and then we'll finish with a video. Terry, I think you commented enough for all of us.